Welcome to Step Up to the Sport, a conversation series bringing together the minds of women's baseball and women in baseball. I'm Kate Haines, your host of today's conversation and the archivist for the International Women's Baseball Center. Today we're joined by Kat Williams and Leslie Heaphy to kick off the 4th annual Women in Baseball Week. Leslie is an associate professor of history at Kent State University at Stark, author and editor of 6 books related to the Negro Leagues and women's baseball, primarily, though one also deals with the New York Mets. Her love of baseball has also brought her to the board of the IWBC and is vice president of Saber, where she also chairs the Women in Baseball Committee for Saber. Kat is a professor of women's sport history at Marshall University, author of the All-American Girls After the AAG PBL, How Playing Pro Ball Shaped Their Lives, and Isabel Lefty Alvarez, The Improbable Life of a Cuban-American Baseball Star. She is a lifelong baseball fan and former shortstop. It is her sincere belief that she accomplished all the former goals because of the latter. Through her teaching, scholarship, and advocacy, she has dedicated many years to the preservation of girls' and women's baseball history. She continues the work as president and founding member of the International Women's Baseball Center. Today, our conversation is going to focus on the state of women in baseball and the role of the IWBC. So let's begin. Welcome, ladies. I know it's a pretty daunting question, but in your own words, what do you think the state of women in baseball is today?
Go ahead, Kat. I'll let you kick it off.
Oh, thanks, Leslie. Well, before I launch into that, I just want to welcome everybody to this new Step Up to the Sport conversation series we're doing. And thank you, Kate and Leslie. The state of women's baseball, wow. We're only supposed to take an hour, but it's complicated. It's not as simple as, oh, we're doing great, or we have a long way to go, although in some ways, both of those things is true. The state of women's baseball is that it is a growing movement. We have a lot of girls and women playing baseball today, more than most people even have an idea or out there on the field. But women are umpires, and they're designing Major League Baseball parks, and they're vice president of Major League Baseball, and they are just every piece of baseball you can imagine. Girls and women are part of that, but then we've always been part of that. That's not new. So it's not enough, though. I mean, that's I know we're going to get into that, but the issues are many. And girls and women have limited access to the game. And I'm not talking about Major League Baseball here. And I hope that's something we'll talk about at some point in this hour as well. Because Major League Baseball is not the end-all be-all for baseball. Okay, that is one version of baseball. And so I would just say that, the state of women's baseball is that we have a long way to go, but there's a movement, and there are a lot of women out there, a lot of men out there, and certainly a lot of girls doing everything they can to drag us along. So I'm sure we'll get into more detail about that.
Right. And do you have anything to add, Leslie?
I would just simply add, because that was well said, it's not where it could be or should be.
Mm-hmm. That's
and
right.
So, I mean, I think that's the complication. It's not, it could be much more and it should be much more,
That's
but
exactly
we have
right.
made progress. And so I think that's where we are, and lots of steps still to go.
That's right.
All right. Well, I'm going to throw a little bit, we have to get into it because of just the time that we're in right now. But I hope that this might be the only time that we address it, and we can kind of move on from the craziness of our lives over the last couple of months. But do you think that this has changed with the pandemic and the loss of a lot of play this year? So we did not get girls nationals this year, but other opportunities have popped up, like an all girls team in Little League for Kentucky. But of course, they're even looking to kind of make sure that they go back to softball in following seasons. We've had to postpone the Women's Baseball World Cup this year, and hopefully we get to play it in November, but it's possible we don't. So do you guys have a couple of things you might want to say about that?
Well, it's unfortunate. It's hit the entire sporting world, and women's baseball, I think in particular, maybe has been a harder hit in one way because we rely so heavily on the tournaments and the play to really get the word out that this is happening. And without those things happening, I think we may lose some momentum that we have to figure out how to recapture. And I think the example in Kentucky on the surface looks like a really good one, but as you pointed out, the article written about it very clearly says the league is looking, this was a stopgap, and they want them to go back to playing softball. So, but we may find out that there's the opportunity, and this is a good example. The girls who were interviewed said, this is so much fun. Most of them had never done it before. They may not want to go back because they've been introduced. And so that's an advantage that we didn't have. And so I think, as I've said on a number of things, we need to take advantage of opportunities when they are presented rather than seeing, unfortunately, what's happening in the world as purely a downside, and this is all negative and we're losing all of these things. What can we be doing in the meantime to help support efforts like what we saw in Kentucky and other places, and doing things like this that help to draw attention to? And we're seeing a lot of these kinds of things popping up that are really working on the media and PR and social media side of things, which is very important.
Right. I would agree, Leslie. I think, who could have predicted, right? Well, we'll not get into that. There were certainly people who did, but that's maybe a different podcast. So, but it certainly pulls us up short when we're talking about women's and girls playing the game, right? I mean, but the flip side of this, and Leslie touched on this, is we have this, right? I have been, and I know Leslie has too, been on a number of podcasts, some other Zoom panels and things like that. And while that's not the same as putting 400 girls on the field, which Baseball for All did along with the IWBC in Rockford last year, that's not the same. But what we're able to do is bring the message to a wider audience. And maybe someone tunes in not because they're, I'm a big advocate for girls and women in baseball, but maybe they are missing baseball. And so they're looking for content, right? They're looking for, okay, what is one little thing I can grab a hold of here? And so what that might do is spark interest in some people. But we can't pretend that this hasn't had a huge impact, as Leslie said, on the entire sporting world. And so part of it is, it's like you take what's thrown, right, and you turn that into an opportunity, and that's the core of what the IWBC is, right? It is about taking what we have and then making, using that as a foundation. And that's kind of what we're able to do with this. But I'm ready for this to be over. I'm ready to see some baseball. I'm ready to, to move on.
And viewers, if you are interested in reading more about that Kentucky situation, I will leave the link underneath for you all and in the episode notes that will follow. Thank you guys for that. So how do we carve out a real place for girls in baseball? I'll just use the IWBC as a way to move forward, because that question has a million different answers. First of all, for viewers who are new to the International Women's Baseball Center, we're about preserving and protecting the history and the legacy of girls and women in all aspects of baseball internationally. And so
from that statement is where everything we do comes from. And so using that as a jumping off place, I would say, we have to first of all, let young girls know they have a history. Let them know that they stand, as I often say, they stand on the shoulders of greatness. Those young girls in Kentucky who are playing baseball right now for the first time, many of them, I guarantee you, unless they've seen the movie A League of Their Own, which I suspect most of them have, because who hasn't? But unless they've seen that, they are unaware, they are unaware that girls and women have always been part of the game of baseball, always. We've always played, we've always coached, we've always umpired, we've always tended the fields and kept the stats and built the stadiums. We have always been part of baseball, but most people, and certainly young girls, don't know that. And so what happens is that you feel like you're the only one. We've all been in that position in one way or another. Oh, I'm the only one, I'm doing this by myself, I must be weird, whatever. And so for me, as a historian and as the president of the IWBC, I think one way we carve out a place is we need to take that history. We need to make sure people know that history. But I am not about taking that history and stuffing it away in acid-free folders and behind glass and all that stuff. We need to pull it out of the shadows, and we need to show people. We need to use that history. We need to inspire those 9, 10, 12, 14-year-old girls by showing them who came before them. I am a firm believer in, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And that to me is the absolute foundation. Now, there are a million different ways that we make this happen, and I'm sure we'll talk some more about that, but I think it starts with that.
And I would say, I think the real interesting part of that question, Kate, is carving out a real place, because that's what you said. And so right. For me, I would agree with everything Kat said, but I would answer it slightly differently on that aspect of it, because I think you can carve out a place that isn't real. And so the idea of it being real says we understand that this is something that is not just tokenism, that this is not just something for the short term, that this is something that's going to last. And for it to be real, it has to be a place that has been carved out that give girls and women, right, from all ages, a true opportunity, and not just like you can do it this year, but not next year, right? A place where they're not the only one, where there's not just one team that's being allowed into. That's that tokenism that says, see, they've got an opportunity. A real place says you have a seat at the table, and it's permanent, and it's not just for today, it's for today, tomorrow, and the foreseeable. And I think that's the real key, is that notion of getting to that point.
Yeah, I agree. And what I would add to that is, this idea that, quote, real baseball is Major League Baseball. Because I get this from people all the time, and I know listeners out there probably do, and I know the two of you do. You're talking to someone about women's baseball. Oh, there's never going to be a woman in the major leagues. So? I mean, I don't care. What is the percentage of boys who play baseball that make it to the major league? Right. I don't know that stat, but it's very tiny. And so my point, though, is that for some reason that's supposed to be the end all be all, and the only reason to have girls and women in baseball is the prospect that they will play sometime in the major league. And my point is that is not what baseball's about. I'm sorry.
No, I was just gonna add to what I was just gonna say, because most people, because it's been this way historically, right? The Negro Leagues had the same issue when they want the idea that lends legitimacy to what you do in the eyes of many. And if you don't get to that pinnacle that is held up as the be all and end all, then you're not legit. Then you're not right. And that's just not the way to look at it. That's not carving out a real place. That's fitting in something that already exists. So you're taking a round, trying to stick it in a square peg, right? Because the system.
Right.
And we're saying, no, it doesn't have to be that way. That's not necessarily a real place.
Well, and that is what that also does is define baseball in a way that is very narrow. And that's not the definition of baseball for me, right? And that's the other piece of it, is that I think what we have to do in order to find that real place, you know, and again, Leslie was right to focus on what does that mean, that real place. Well, that's where there are girls and women of all ages and abilities playing, and that, yeah, I would love to see a women's baseball league. I am not, if a woman is good enough and she tries out on whatever level for a men's baseball team, whether it is single A or independent league or eventually major leagues, if she tries it out and she's good enough, then yeah, she damn well better get a shot. But at the same time, women are not as fast, they're not as strong, they're not as big. I played shortstop. I have been run over by some rather large women while I'm trying to turn a double play, and that's painful enough. Now, I do not want to be run over by a 200-pound, 6'2" man running to second base. So my point of that is to say that we're not in competition with men. We don't need to be in competition with men. This baseball is the single best sport on the planet. And that's why it is so important that we get a chance to play. You know, one of the things that I often say in interviews and stuff is that, you know, this baseball cannot be considered America's game when half of Americans can't play it. And so what my argument is about a real place is a place for girls and women to play the game at whatever level it is. And then what happens beyond that is a whole different story. But I think Leslie's right that this is, you know, there's not an easy answer, but a real spot is going to be up to us. That's the other thing. Carving out a real place for women, that's going to be up to us. We can't wait for someone else to do it.
And it's a real place beyond just those who play as well. I just want to, because it's
Absolutely.
easy to focus solely on that playing side of things, but it's the whole gamut of every aspect of it. Otherwise, that's also not real.
Exactly. I mean, we have Perry Barber is on our board. Perry Barber has been an umpire for what, 35 years or something, and she is instrumental in recruiting other girls and women to umpiring, for example. That is invaluable. And so yes, I mean, all aspects of baseball, not just playing. But there's no reason why we can't have that real place. And that's, you know, we're dedicated to helping make that happen, but we're not the only organization that's doing that either. Fortunately, there are a number of them.
Yeah, and I think that holding on to that narrow definition is where it really comes into play. So you said that, and I thought of the old 90s NCAA commercials where they're talking about student athletes, and student athletes go, 95% of student athletes go pro in something other than their sport.
That's right.
And I think that's that narrow definition that you're talking about. Like, you expect a student athlete to kind of tunnel their way through into the professionals, and that's not what's happening. And that doesn't mean that those student athletes' experience and their place there is not real. So thank you for that. And of course, that also pulls into, why have other sports been able to do this, to be able to create this real space for girls and women? Do you think that there's something wrong with baseball, that we're not capable of putting on these movements that have led to soccer becoming one of the most popular women's sports in the United States, and of course is growing in popularity throughout the world, or other sports like that have been capable of seeming to break those barriers and define that real space for girls and women?
Well, this is always the be all and end all question that we always get. This is, and I think there's a variety of answers to it. And I think one of them is, you mentioned soccer, and I think there can be some things that are specific to an individual sport. And so, for example, with soccer, I think it's the lack of a feeling of competition against men's, because men's soccer is not that popular. So there was a space to carve out.
In the United States.
Right. Yes. Because you were saying, yeah, that was what I was talking about. Yeah.
Yes. But I thought the specification was probably important.
So here in the United States, right, there's not, since that's what there's not that competition. And so that sense that they have a place. Okay. Right. But it also then points to the idea that baseball, when we're talking about players in particular, women's baseball in many other countries is much farther along than it is in the United States. So that's that opposite, where here, and that's that one piece of it is, I think, that sense of people seeing it as competition instead of, well, no, we can have our space, we can have our league over here and you have yours, and it doesn't have to be seen that way. But I think the bigger issue, at least the way I understand, and this is coming from me being a historian like Kat, is the history of baseball itself and how it's attached to two understandings of America and American history and culture. And that is the idea that it's a game that from its very beginnings was touted as a symbol of masculinity. And all through the 19th century, that was one of the number one things they talked about with baseball. This is a symbol of what it meant to be masculine. And that was such a part of the growth of this country. You know, think about the Wild West, think about all of these things and this promotion of that idea. And so they specifically went looking for an activity, a sport that had that component to it. And baseball being the earliest, of course, it comes before in this country, football and basketball and all of these others. It was the sport at the time, hence the reason it then becomes, here's the other, America's national pastime. And of course, in the 19th century, when that term was coined, it was very deliberate. America's national pastime. We are saying something about our values, about what we believe by attaching that term to and we're saying something about that, in this case, sport. And one of the things we said was, it was masculine. That is America's national attitude, right? That's the baggage that baseball has carried with it. And baseball is nothing if not about tradition, just in its nature, right? So that's a tradition that people feel challenged. Even if they don't necessarily always recognize it, why else do you create softball as an alternate and say, let them go play there? They're not affecting our image of this sport and our image of America as a consequence. We still call it America's national pastime today, even though it's not the most watched sport. It's not about that. It's about what is represented by it. So for me, that's the issue that baseball is up against, I think. And that's so hard to work against because it's not something concrete that you can say, oh, if we just did this, right? This is attitudinal. And we're seeing, in the country right now, the remnant coming up of lots of these attitudes that are very much present, and you can see how hard that is to change. And
I think Leslie I agree with everything she said. I think that it is very rooted in this this idea of American exceptionalism, of using whether it's sport or other things in the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century to, quote, Americanize immigrants, whatever. And of course, if you're going to Americanize, you want to masculinize, right? I mean, because that's what a real American is. And so baseball became very androcentric, and it continues to be, hence the questions that we get from people, well, a woman is never going to be able to play in the major leagues. So all of that's connected, right? I mean, that's the way that we meaning, general public sees baseball in this very masculine way, because as Leslie said, that's the way it's been framed. Now, for me, yes, that's true. But is there, I mean, you have to ask yourself about basketball, for example, because you brought up other sports. Why is it that baseball is different? Well, as Leslie said, it's rooted in history.
Oh yeah.
But at the same time, it's rooted in this determination to hang on to the definition of American as masculine. And so it's all, I don't want to get into this, where it's all about sexism and well, it is, but it's also, it's very complicated. And, I don't want to just simply say, Major League Baseball, they're all bad,
No.
or they're this or they're that. It is, Major League Baseball could not flip a switch and make this change. Even Major League Baseball could not do that, because those girls, and we keep using this example in Kentucky, and, those girls they're being told, you're going to go back to softball, right? So that's not about Major League Baseball. That's about the very grassroots nature of society and what baseball means to a community. And it means certain standards. And women and girls, not so much.
Think about Albert Spalding talking about history, right?
Yeah.
What did he use when he went over as the Goodwill Tour to spread American values and American ideals to the world? It was baseball.
Baseball.
And of course he goes at the end of the 19th century. By that point, basketball and football are being played. That's not what they choose. It's baseball.
Right.
Baseball was declared through a commission set up, right? The Mills Committee, to be a truly American sport.
That's
and it had no connection, even though we know that's not true. But they deliberately, and they were given that mission to prove it.
Right. Yeah.
Whatever you have to do to make sure that people understand this game is American and not anybody else.
Right.
We know it was being played as rounders by girls.
Yeah.
In England, for example, long before. And so that that's where I think, and for a lot of people, that's really hard to grasp because it's not a tangible idea, and attitudes, that takes education to change that.
Exactly. And that gets us back to some of the very foundations of the IWBC. And the fact that we use that history, we use the fact that we have a history in the game, and we use that to educate. But it's not just about educating girls that they have a history. It's about educating everyone, because I guarantee you, if we started right now teaching about that history, whether it's in classrooms and we use it to talk about social studies, for example, or something else, or if it's about teaching it on a little league level, that girls and women have always been part of the game, and that girls have as much access to the game as the boys do. It is as important for those 10-year-old boys to learn that as it is those girls, because 40 years later, 50 years later, when those guys are buying teams or creating teams or coaching teams, they will have grown up with a girl playing left field, or a girl playing catcher, or a girl as their, I don't know, whatever, their manager. So it is important that, again, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And the same is true for those boys. And so one of the, going back to the sort of foundation of your question, what's wrong with baseball? Why is it that we have a WNBA? We have women's soccer, we have, whatever. But baseball is resistant. Well, it is historically rooted, but it is also about some things that are connected to equivalency sports, for example, softball. There is no bigger proponent of Title IX on the planet than I am. But I think that as a result of Title IX, softball comes along as an equivalency sport, and has in many ways then served the purpose of keeping girls out of baseball. And now, believe me, I am a big fan of softball too. I played competitive fast pitch softball. It's a wonderful game, but it is not baseball. And so when girls and women are being told, oh, go over here and play this game, that automatically feeds into these now century-old ideas about masculinity and the sport of baseball. And so we just keep perpetuating the same ideas. So my thing is, you throw a monkey wrench into that, and you're like, oh no, we're not doing this anymore. We're going to stop that cycle. And maybe that looks like putting young girls on a field with Baseball for All tournaments. And maybe it looks like the IWBC building its own museum and educational center and Women's Baseball Hall of Fame or whatever it is. We got to stop that cycle because it's not going to stop for us.
Right.
We have got to take the reins.
But part of the problem is also, I mean, to what you're saying, Kat, so we get them started at that young age, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of that going on and those kinds of examples, but it doesn't continue. So that's the problem. There's no future for them.
Yeah.
So they go into softball because yes, they're told, but it's also because that's where the scholarship dollars are for schools.
Yep.
That's where there's a future. If they want to continue to play, why would you take the risk that you're never, and so
I agree.
It takes a lot. So that's the other piece that often nobody really wants to throw out there and talk about. That's a huge part of what's wrong with baseball in terms of its larger structure.
And especially coming from like players I actually know that I've watched grow through the system, and you hear them talking about, choosing softball over baseball because there's the opportunity to make the Olympic team, or there's scholarship money, of course. Or, even USA Baseball recruits its female players from college softball.
Right. Many of them.
Many of them. Yeah, not all of them, no.
Right.
Yes.
Because they just don't have another alternative.
Right. Right. And you're absolutely right. It's not, when I say they're sort of told to go that way, that is a long-standing issue. And so that is, because it's a long-standing issue, what that means then is that becomes the path. But I would point out that I think it is a myth that there are all these scholarships out there for women to play softball in college. Because that's just not true, right? Now, there are basically zero scholarships for young women to play baseball in college. But what I'm saying is, it's like, if that's what you want to do, then that's fine, but it shouldn't be the only option. And that's what I'm talking about. And then beyond that, what that means is, when I say we got to throw a monkey wrench in that means, there needs to be something else. There needs to be girls in Little League. There needs to be girls baseball tournaments. There needs to be girls playing at a 15, 16, 17-year-old, but there also needs to be a women's professional baseball league. And there's no reason why that can't happen. I mean, money, but but seriously, it's not like we don't know women who have money, right? So what I'm saying is, the problem is it comes to a screeching halt because they're sort of pushed in that direction. But the monkey wrench I'm talking about is a big ass monkey wrench. All right. I mean, I'm talking about, all right, let's stop this. If you want to play softball, go play softball. But let's create those regional tournaments. Let's create that. And then let's set up a women's professional baseball league. And I know the place where they could play, Rockford, Illinois.
Well, I guess that's a good way to kind of segue into what the role of the IWBC is. So you guys have talked about the International Women's Baseball Center and its hope to preserve and protect the right for girls and women to be involved in baseball in whatever capacity they feel that they want to, whether that's playing or managing, umpiring. Of course, another shout out to Perry Barber and all of her good work. But of course, you guys are both historians. Preserving and protecting the history of girls and women's in baseball, of course, makes sense to you. But it might not to everybody else. And I definitely know in the world today, continuously reiterating, knowing the history of something might help you understand it a little bit better, sometimes falls on deaf ears. So how can knowing the history...
Sometimes, yeah. Right.
I'm sorry. A lot of the time.
Yeah.
So how can knowing the history, and you guys have talked about this a little bit in the last couple of minutes, but how can knowing that history really help current and future girls and women in baseball?
Well, I mean, it's the simple idea that people need to see themselves when they are looking at something. And if they don't see themselves, then they don't feel that that's something they can do, right? But it's also knowing that you're not alone, that you're not the only one. It gives you, when somebody tells you, you know, that you shouldn't be out there, to be able to respond to that with saying, yes, I should, because this person and this, so, you know, this is not new. This is just because they don't know, just because that person is ignorant when they say that to them, because that's all that's showing. It helps them realize that this is possible, that this has always been possible. And the more the people understand the history, the more they will realize on this particular topic specifically, that women have always been involved, right? And when we talk about, you hear people saying today all the time, people are coming, women are entering the game. That is not true. And probably the best book you can, if you want to hear somebody articulate this really well, read Deb Shattuck's book on the Bloomer Girls, because she makes talk about history, right? She makes the best case and really lays it out beautifully for saying that women are simply coming back to the game because they got pushed out, but they were there from the very beginning.
Right.
And there was a concerted effort and so understanding how that happened means you could understand how to not let it happen again, and see some of the things that you could address by understanding that, wait, we were there. And then, so what happened? Why did women leave get pushed out? How did they come back? How are we bringing them back? How do we avoid, the repetition of some of those things? What do we learn from? And so I think it's that, for me, it's that combination of both those things, but I'll let Kat jump.
Yeah, I mean, I think it, like all of your questions, Kate, which have been really excellent ones, the answers are multifaceted, right? So, yeah, sadly for two professional historians, well, three, because I happen to know you two are a master's level historian, that we, the history and knowing the history and using the history is important for all the reasons we've talked about. And so the IWBC was created because a group of women got together because no one else was doing this, right? Like there are all kinds of organizations that are focused on women's baseball, on some level of girls and women in baseball. But nobody stepped up and said, we need to preserve this history internationally. Leslie mentioned this earlier, that women's baseball is huge internationally. You know, for it to be America's game, you know, we have left American women off that chart, but there are hugely successful women's baseball programs in nearly every other, I mean, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, Vietnam has a women's baseball team. And so, you know, there's that piece of it. It's about telling that story and bringing that to the forefront, but nobody else was saying, let's not just preserve it, but let's celebrate it. Let's celebrate it and let's bring it all along. So the IWBC's job, as I see it, is to, yes, literally reach out and protect that history. In other words, the manuscripts, the uniforms, all of that stuff, that tangible stuff. We are going to have a place where it is preserved, where people can use it to research and learn, where it is visible to some people. There will be lots of interactive exhibits at our center, but we're not just going to be this stagnant, dark, dingy little museum someplace where people come in and there's a uniform under glass and, oh, look, isn't that great? And you never want to come back because you've seen it. It's going to be interactive. It's going to be alive. And so we will have that. But the other thing that we will have is a Women's Baseball Hall of Fame. Now there is an online version of a Women's Baseball Hall of Fame, and I'm not taking away from the work that they're doing. But what I'm talking about is there will be a physical location where we can celebrate that. And celebrating it, being part of it, that is an extremely important piece of moving us forward. But the other piece is this. We also co-sponsor women's baseball and girls baseball tournaments. We have brought Baseball for All tournaments to Rockford, Illinois, our home, a number of times. We do all kinds of things like that to actually take that history and use it, you know, give it to those girls. And I think that is the key of what we do, right? We use the history.
History has to be relevant, right?
Yes,
Otherwise people,
yes.
that's why it falls on deaf ears, to use your,
Yes.
right, Kate?
Yeah. And an example of that, you know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, nearly everyone, hopefully everyone has seen the movie A League of Their Own. And about 3 years ago, I think it was about 3 years ago, Baseball for All brought their national tournament to Rockford. For the listeners who aren't familiar, Rockford, of course, is the home of the Rockford Peaches, the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League team that was highlighted in the movie A League of Their Own. Meyer Stadium, Meyer Field is where they played, and that has been renovated and preserved by an organization called Friends of Meyer. And the IWBC co-sponsored the women, or the Baseball for All's tournament. And about 3 years ago, we had the opening ceremonies on Meyer Field. And so all the teams were in the outfield. They were in their uniforms. They carried their banners. And so one by one, the teams marched into Meyer. They were started by, yes, a 10 and under team. 10 and under team. These girls, 10 years old, marched into Meyer carrying their banner in their baseball uniforms. Those 10-year-olds marched into the arms of 90-year-old Maybelle Blair and 85-year-old Shirley Berkovich from the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. And you know what? Every single one of those 10-year-olds knew who those women were. They knew about them, they thanked them, they hugged them, and if you watched that and the hair didn't stand up on the back of your neck, you were not breathing. And that's what this is about. It is about bringing those pioneers of the past together with the pioneers of the future. And that's how you bring the history to the present and make it relevant. And when those girls walked onto that field, they walked onto a field that made history, and they made history in the process. And that's how you make it useful.
It's also, I would just add one final, for me, it's also reminding people that history helps us understand that what's happening is not an exception, right? And if you continue to see something as an exception, it's never going to change anything. It's always going to be seen, but you can only get past that if you begin to understand, well, no, this is not the only time it's happened. There is a past here. There's a story to be told that just hasn't been told. And so it's our job to tell those stories and to help tell those stories, to make sure those stories get told, and to dig out the ones that even we don't know about, right? Because there's lots and lots of them out there.
Oh yeah, every day we learn new ones.
And that allows us to see what happened that Kat just described so eloquently.
All right, and if you guys are interested in checking out Deb Shattuck's Bloomer Girls, I will put a link in the description, and check out our social media for more content with the IWBC archive. We are currently digital content, but you can always check out the IWBC's hope for eventually having a center in Rockford, Illinois, right across from Meyer Stadium, which Kat just mentioned has been renovated in the last couple of years. So we have about 15 minutes left, guys. So we do have a couple of questions that have been put in by the public, but before we get there, is there anything else you guys want to talk about on the role of the IWBC? It's kind of course, been very well weaved into your conversation on the state of women in baseball, which if you guys think that they're passionate about the state of women in baseball, you should just listen to them, get passionate about talking about the International Women's Baseball Center and what we've been able to accomplish in the last couple of years. But if there's anything else you guys want to talk to before we get to questions, feel free.
I would just simply like to encourage listeners to become a member of the IWBC. You know, we are different from every other organization focused on girls and women in baseball. And by the way, we support all those other organizations as well, and they support us. But the IWBC is made up of former ball players from the All-Americans. Leslie and I are history professors, and we have librarians, we have a retired judge, we have Perry Barber, who's an umpire. We have an amazing group of people as our board, and we have come from February 22nd, 19, I'm showing my age, 2014, a few of us were sitting around at Maybelle Blair's house in California, and talking about these needs, the things that were missing from the world of girls and women in baseball. And over pizza and beer, quite literally, over pizza and beer, we created the International Women's Baseball Center. And from that moment to this, we have dedicated countless hours to making this a reality. And so join us, and there's a lot yet to do. So we can always use the help.
And that would be the only thing I would reiterate of what Kat said, is that very last part. Join us and help us. This is a joint effort, and it's only going to work with the cooperation and collaboration of all those who are interested and want and have time, or just want to know something and say, what can I do to help? Well, come find out. Talk to us. Talk to, you know, there's so many opportunities for people to get involved. Yeah.
And we're all, by the way, we're all volunteers. No one is paid for their work. Kate, sorry to tell you that. But no
news to me.
No, you know, we're all volunteers, and we do this, and it is our life work, because we are dedicated to it and believe so much in it. And so, yeah, join us. And in addition to that, we're actually kind of fun.
I don't know if I'd go that far. All right, but we did have a couple of questions. Just for viewers, continue to check out our socials for announcements of new guests. And we always give the opportunity for you to be able to ask questions, even if we're not doing a live show. Our first question comes from Chloe on Facebook, and she asked, what is the one common myth about women's baseball that you want to debunk? I know there are a lot of them, so if you could pick one, and I'm going to also cut you down a bit. You got a minute to do it.
Oh, mine's easy.
Okay, what is it?
Mine's easy. That women are new to the game.
Yeah.
That's not true.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that really is the most common myth, I think. And that we're new to the game, that you know, all of a sudden we're getting all uppity and decide we want to play the game. And yeah, not so much.
All right, and this one kind of helps pull into some things that the IWBC is going to be doing in the next couple of months, and our next guest on the conversation series as well. But Kippy007 on Instagram asked, does the IWBC have plans to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Negro League Baseball? Can you both
take it away, Leslie?
Why, yes, we do.
Thank you for asking.
That's a marvelous question, and it's
why I waited to last.
But it highlights kind of what we've been talking about just in general before I get into it, the whole notion of celebrating history, right? So this year is the Negro League Centennial in the middle of a pandemic. And so unfortunately, lots of things that were scheduled for their celebration have not happened the way they could have. And yet many things are happening, and they're finding new ways. And so for the IWBC, this is an important aspect of what we wanted to do. And so Coming up, our next guest on these conversations is going to be Lauren Meyer, who is the director of a wonderful documentary film called The Other Boys of Summer. And if you have not seen it, I can't recommend it enough. And she's doing all kinds of showings of that film, but she's going to come on and talk about the experience of creating that film, the life and stories of some of those individuals that she interviewed. And so that will be a nice lead in to then the IWBC and Saber, the Society for American Baseball Research, are co-sponsoring our second women's baseball conference in the weekend of September 11th to the 13th in Rockford. It was originally intended to be at Rockford University, as they are our hosts, but because of, again, what's happening in the world, it will be a virtual for the most part. But one of the theme of the conference in and of itself is a celebration of Black participation in baseball. Our theme is African American women in baseball. And so that's the overarching for the entire weekend. And then on Saturday, we will have a specific celebration to focus on the centennial of the Negro Leagues. And through that, obviously bringing in the stories of so many women who both played in the official Negro Leagues, because that's what we're celebrating, right? So most people are familiar probably with the names, or if they're not, they should be: Tony Stone, Mamie Johnson, and Connie Morgan. Mamie may be a little more familiar to people because of Monet Davis a few years ago when she pitched in the Little League World Series. They put, talking about sort of Kat's earlier story, right? Bringing the path. Monet got to meet Mamie Johnson, who was a pitcher in the 1950s for the Indianapolis Clowns. And so certainly celebrating those names, celebrating Effa Manley, the only woman elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame to date. And then lots of stories and lots of life experiences of many others that people don't know anything about. And not to give too much away, but we're going to be talking about people like Olivia Taylor and Pearl Barnett and Isabel Baxter and Desiree Robinson and Minnie Forbes being the only owner of the Negro Leagues who is still alive today, owned a team in Grand Rapids, had a family connection to the Negro Leagues. Her uncle was Ted Raspberry, who owned the Detroit Stars. And so this is the opportunity, and I think it's it's very, as you can obviously tell, I'm very excited by this opportunity to do this, but this is what the IWBC, this is the kind of thing we're talking about. And so that celebration is going to happen on September 12th. So people just need to stay tuned as we start to put out more material and encourage people to join us virtually and in person for that particular celebration. If they find themselves close to Rockford, more details will be coming out about that, but that's our upcoming plans to celebrate the Negro Leagues and do our part, as Bob Kendrick from the Negro League Museum has encouraged people to tip their caps to the Negro Leagues. And this will be part of our tipping the cap to the Negro Leagues in 2020.
I would just like to add to that we are very fortunate at the IWBC that we have in Leslie one of the foremost scholars on the Negro Leagues, and certainly women connected to the Negro Leagues. And so I would just encourage everyone, wherever there's a celebration, that one near you or virtually, make sure that you participate in that, because the 100th anniversary of the Negro Leagues should not have to be celebrated in the middle of a pandemic. But make sure that you participate in some way. But know that what we're doing, what the IWBC is doing with the help of others, including the Negro League Museum and some others, will be second to none and due largely to Leslie Heaphy. And I want to thank you for that, but I also want people to know that IWBC benefits greatly from what Leslie does and who she is. And so I just want to make sure that everyone knows that.
Well,
so I tip my
thanks,
hat
Kat.
to you.
Thanks, Kat. But it truly is it's indicative of the collaborative efforts, because we are working with
Yeah.
the Negro Leagues Museum. We're working
Right.
with the Center for Negro Leagues Museum in Birmingham.
Right.
There's a whole variety of organizations that are helping us to make this possible.
And how cool is that?
It's going to be, it's going to be very, as it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will party. There's no doubt about it. We may do it virtually, but we will party.
Yep. And of course, if viewers have any other virtual events or whatnot, you can definitely let the IWBC know on any of our social medias, and we will hopefully be able to promote it a little bit. We would love to be able to get more word out for your guys' events. I would, of course, like to thank both of you again for joining us and for your work in the world of women's baseball. To send things off, I have one final question for you guys. You're going to have to keep it a little short again. I apologize. I know it's so hard.
You have met us before, right?
But what would your dream be for the state of women's baseball, or the potential impact the IWBC could have? How would it look to you? I know. I'm sorry, guys. I've kept it too close for you.
Go ahead, Leslie.
Yeah. I mean, the sort of cliched answer is, I would like to see the day when every girl, every woman, no matter her age, color, background, has a true opportunity to be a part of this incredible game in whatever they want, whether that's to play in Little League and then that's it and they walk away from it, to be the owner of a major league team, to help create a professional league and leagues. But I'd also love to see it on the international scale, because that's what's missing, I think, in baseball in general. It's the major leagues and everything else. And I would love to see women's baseball being a truly inclusive, equal opportunity for it at all levels, at every opportunity, across every barrier that you can possibly think of. And that's what I would like to see happen. And before I then turn it over to Kat, I did want to say one other shout out that I didn't mean to miss. It's really interesting that today, as we are recording this, is July 19th, and it happens to be Rachel Robinson's 98th birthday.
Oh my God.
And so talk about it, connecting all these pieces. So wanted to just give a shout out to Rachel and say happy birthday from the IWBC.
Oh, absolutely.
Years old today.
Wow. That's amazing. Good for her. That's exciting. What I would, God, my dream is, I want to be standing in the IWBC's educational center and watch the first girls come in and see their history and learn about their history. And I want to live long enough to see it. I want the IWBC to be a home for women's baseball internationally. I want there to be a physical location where, people take a pilgrimage every summer sometimes and go to Cooperstown, right? And they can touch baseball history. I want the IWBC to be that for girls and women in baseball. I want to be and we are right now, the only physical place where girls and women's baseball history has a place, and I want that to continue. And I want to live to see it. So
couldn't have said it better myself. And of course, Kat, you're not the only one that wants to live to see it. Maybelle Blair, one of our board members.
Yeah.
That is her. I mean, if we could truly do, that's her wish. And she says it all the time.
Yeah.
To see that happen. And when that happens, we will know that we have, it sort of goes back to your very first question. Hey, where's the state of women's baseball today, and where do we want it to be?
Yeah. Maybelle Blair, for those of you that don't know, is 92 and calls me on probably every other day to encourage me to actually do something. And most of those conversations end with, all right, Kat, well, I'm on this side of the grass. So yeah, I feel the urgency. I think we all do.
All right. Well, I think that is a perfect way to end. So thank you guys again.
Thank you.
For
Thank you,
joining
Kate.
us.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. This was awesome.
It was fun.
Yep.
Thank you again for watching, and thank you to both Kat Williams and Leslie